9 seconds flat. Pump gas, a 1941 Willys. Not nitro, not factory money. 3 men from Akron, Ohio, Lenny Stone, Bill Fatman Woods, Tim Cook, who decided California had been thinking about gassers entirely wrong. The most copied, most rule-changing machine in A/gas supercharged history didn't come from Pomona. It came from Rubber Industry, Ohio, where Stone stripped a junkyard coupe to its bones and started from the answer, shortest elapsed time possible. Everything else was a variable. The gasser class existed before Stone Woods Cook made it famous, but only barely. In the mid-1950s, the National Hot Rod Association had codified a set of rules for street-legal production. Body cars running on gasoline. No nitromethane, no exotic fuels, just the stuff you could pump at a filling station. The classes were organized by engine displacement divided by vehicle weight, which meant the game had 2 levers. You could push displacement up, or you could yank weight down. Most teams pulled both levers hard and assumed they were done. Lenny Stone pulled a 3rd lever that most of the competition hadn't seriously considered. He thought about wheelbase. A short wheelbase car, Stone understood, had a mechanical advantage at the launch that longer wheelbase machines couldn't replicate through sheer power. When a car with a short wheelbase accelerates hard, weight transfers rearward faster, loading the drive tires more effectively in the critical first 60 feet where the race is almost always decided. California teams were running Chevys, Fords, Studebakers, cars with respectable but not exceptional wheelbases. Stone started looking at pre-war and early post-war American production vehicles with the eye of a man who understood levers. The 1941 Willys Americar had a 104-inch wheelbase. A standard 1955 Chevrolet sedan sat on 115 inches. That 11 inches in Stone's calculation was not a footnote. It was the difference between launching like a slingshot and launching like a man who had not finished thinking about the problem. Bill Woods brought the mechanical brutality. Where Stone brought engineering logic, Woods brought an almost frightening willingness to cut, weld, strip, and rebuild anything that wasn't contributing directly to forward motion. The story of the Stone Woods Cook Willys is inseparable from Woods's philosophy that a race car is not a street car with modifications. It is a purpose-built device wearing street car clothing because the rulebook requires it. The clothing could be as thin as the rules allowed. The structure underneath could be whatever the men in the shop decided to make it. Tim Cook was the money and the logistics, which matters more than most histories of drag racing acknowledge. Having the idea is not enough. Having the shop time is not enough. Someone has to find the parts, cut the checks, load the trailer, book the match races, and make sure the team shows up to the right strip on the right weekend. Cook made the operation function as a business rather than an expensive hobby, which is why Stone Woods Cook could sustain their campaign across years, while many equally talented competitors flared briefly and went home broke. The 1941 Willys Americar was not, by any measure anyone applied at the time of its manufacture, a performance automobile. It was a compact economy car, built by a company that would spend the war years making Jeeps and would never fully recover its civilian passenger car business afterward. The Americar had a flathead 4-cylinder engine, a body style that prioritized interior room over aerodynamics, and a buyer base that wanted transportation rather than excitement. None of that mattered to Stone and Woods. What mattered was the body's dimensions, its weight, and the fact that it was cheap. Willys bodies were becoming available in junkyards and at salvage auctions for almost nothing through the late 1950s, because nobody wanted them. They were old, they were unglamorous, and they had no cultural cachet in an era when Americans were buying into the chrome-laden excess of late Eisenhower automotive design. A Willys in 1958 said, "Depression survivor, not performance machine." That too was part of the calculation. Stone and Woods could buy these bodies for pennies and build them into weapons, while the California shops were spending real money on newer, flashier, and, in the specific context of drag racing, inferior raw material. The body itself presented engineering challenges that the team treated as design opportunities. The Willys coupe had a steep rake to its front end, which, when the car was set up on a drag car's nose-high stance, tires in the rear elevated to transfer weight. Front end up, for the same reason, created an aggressive, forward-leaning silhouette that became the visual signature of the gasser class. The shape said, without any lettering or flame jobs, that this car was not going to stop and that it was going to be unpleasant to race against. Stone stripped the body to its absolute minimum legal weight. The interior was gutted. Glass was replaced with plexiglass where possible. Every component that didn't contribute to making the car move forward faster was evaluated and, usually, removed. What remained was the silhouette of a Willys coupe surrounding a purpose-built race vehicle that used the coupe's legal body designation as its entry ticket to the class. The engine at the center of the Stonewood's Cook operation through most of its dominant period was a Chrysler Hemi. Specifically, the early firepower units and their evolution through the late 1950s and early 1960s. The choice of the Chrysler hemispherical combustion chamber over the Chevrolet small block that most of their competitors were running was not an accident of parts availability. It was a studied decision about thermal efficiency, breathing capacity, and the specific demands of gasoline-only competition. The hemispherical combustion chamber, the feature that gave the engine its nickname and its fundamental advantage, positions the intake and exhaust valves on opposite sides of the dome-shaped chamber rather than clustering them together as in a conventional wedge design. This arrangement allows larger valves, better airflow into and out of the chamber, and a more complete combustion event because the flame front travels uniformly outward from the central spark plug. In practical terms, for a team running on gasoline and trying to extract every possible unit of energy from each combustion event, the Hemi was a more efficient converter of fuel to power than its contemporaries. Woods ported and relieved the heads with the same precision he brought to every aspect of the car. Porting, the process of smoothing, enlarging, and reshaping the passages that carry the fuel-air mixture into the combustion chamber and the exhaust gases out of it, is as much art as engineering. A poorly ported head can negate the advantages of the best combustion chamber design. A brilliantly ported head can transform a good engine into something genuinely threatening. Woods's heads were, by the accounts of competitors who eventually managed to inspect them, genuinely threatening. The supercharger mounted atop the engine was a Roots-type blower, the kind of supercharger that uses two meshing lobes rotating in opposite directions to physically push air into the intake manifold rather than waiting for the pistons to draw it in. The blower gave the gasoline-fed Hemi a forced induction advantage that partially compensated for the energy deficit of pump gas versus nitromethane, while keeping the combination within the class regulations that required gasoline. It sat proud of the hood in the fashion of the era, visible and aggressive, a billboard announcement that whatever was coming down the other lane was in serious trouble. The displacement that Stone and Wood settled on for their record-breaking runs was optimized specifically for the class weight formula. The NHRA's class structure divided competitors by their engine's cubic inch displacement against their vehicle's competition weight. A heavier car needed more displacement to achieve the same class designation, while a lighter car could run less engine and still qualify favorably. Stone's obsessive weight reduction of the Willys body meant the team could run a displacement figure that seemed almost modest compared to what their heavier California rivals were forced to package in order to compete in the same class. The Willys was lighter than it had any right to be, which meant the engine could be whatever size maximized output rather than whatever size was needed to satisfy a weight formula designed for vehicles that hadn't been stripped with Wood's particular brand of enthusiasm. The NHRAUS, Nationals at Indianapolis Raceway Park, is the drag racing equivalent of the Kentucky Derby, the event that defines careers, the reference point against which every other win is measured. In 1962, Stone Woods Cook arrived at Indianapolis with a car that had already posted impressive times on the Midwest match race circuit. But the Nationals were different. The Nationals brought out the best California equipment, the factory-backed programs, and the teams that had been winning the biggest stages in the sport for years. The Willys ran through the class eliminations without drama. This is worth emphasizing because it describes something unusual. At the highest level of competition in their class, on the biggest stage in the sport, the car was consistent, not lucky. Consistency at the quarter mile means the combination, engine, transmission, rear end, tire, suspension, driver, is dialed in to a degree that pure talent cannot replicate. You can drive a well-tuned car to a single great run through circumstance and adrenaline. You cannot consistently run the same tenths of a second variation over an entire day of eliminations through anything except engineering competence. Stone drove the car. This is another detail that tends to get lost when the team is discussed, because Stone's reputation is primarily as a builder and tuner. But he also sat behind the wheel at the starting line, staged the car, waited for the Christmas tree to count down, and then managed the launch and the run in real time. The driver's ability to manage wheel spin at the launch, the art of putting just enough of the car's power to the tire without breaking it loose, is as important as any component decision made in the shop. Stone was not just a builder who drove. He was a racer who understood what the car was telling him through the seat and the wheel, and who could translate that feedback into adjustments between rounds. The time slips from that 1962 campaign told a story that the California establishment found genuinely uncomfortable to read. A short wheelbase Ohio car running on gasoline was posting elapsed times that the most sophisticated equipment in the sport was struggling to match. The times were not marginal victories. They were, in some rounds, substantial enough to constitute a kind of argument, not about who had won that particular race, but about whether the prevailing approach to building a gasser was actually correct. It was not correct. Stone Woods Cook had demonstrated this with empirical clarity. Between the big national events, the Stone Woods Cook team sustained their operation and built their reputation through the match race circuit, a largely informal network of appearance bookings, side bets, and promotional events that formed the economic backbone of professional drag racing in the early 1960s. Match racing was exactly what it sounds like. 2 cars, 1 race, usually with an appearance fee paid to the more famous team, and side money wagered on the outcome. The team with the reputation for winning attracted the bookings. The team that attracted the bookings could afford to keep racing. It was a circular economy that rewarded both performance and showmanship, and Stone Woods Cook delivered both. The Willys was a crowd car. This requires explanation because from the outside the car was not dramatic in the way that the top fuel dragsters and funny cars of the era were dramatic. It didn't run on nitromethane, which meant it didn't produce the chest cavity compressing blast of sound and the blue flame that turned spectators into converts at 50 yards. What it did was something subtler and, for serious racing fans, more impressive. It ran the numbers, every time, against anyone. Strip promoters from Pomona to Virginia Beach understood that booking Stone Woods Cook against their local hero was a guaranteed sellout, because the local hero, regardless of equipment, funding, or reputation, was almost certainly going to lose. And the crowd was going to learn something about the limits of their assumptions in the process. The team ran against California legends, against factory-backed entries, against cars with bigger budgets and better publicity. They won the vast majority of those match races, and they charged appearance fees that reflected the fact that their presence meant the promoter was going to have a full house. The income from the circuit funded the shop in Akron, which funded the development program, which produced better times, which raised the appearance fees. Stone, Woods, and Cook had built a self-sustaining competitive machine, and the machine that sustained it was a 1941 Willys coupe that everyone in drag racing had come to regard with something between admiration and dread. The influence of the Stone, Woods, Cook program on the wider gasser class is difficult to overstate because it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most obvious level, the team demonstrated that the Willys coupe body was the optimal platform for A/gas supercharged competition. And within a few years, every serious team in the class was either running a Willys or explaining publicly why their alternative was actually better. It usually wasn't. But the deeper influence was conceptual. Stone, Woods, Cook had demonstrated, with repeatable empirical results across years of competition at the highest levels, that wheelbase and weight mattered more than most teams had appreciated. This reoriented how the entire class thought about car selection, weight reduction, and the relationship between vehicle dynamics and engine output. It was not enough to build the most powerful engine. The engine had to live in the right vehicle, and right meant optimized for weight and wheelbase in ways that required rethinking assumptions that most teams had imported from streetcar culture without examination. The California hot rod shops, names like Tommy Ivo's operation, the Stone, Woods, Cook influenced builds at various Pomona area facilities, began visiting Akron or requesting detailed conversations with members of the team. Information flowed unevenly, as it always does in a competitive environment where the information itself is a competitive asset. But the basic lessons were impossible to keep secret once the car was posting its times in public competition. You could measure a Willys. You could weigh one. You could examine the class legal aspects of the setup at any event where the car competed. The details of the engine program were Woods' proprietary knowledge, but the fundamental architecture of what the team was doing was visible to anyone paying attention. By 1963 and 1964, the gasser class at national events looked markedly different than it had in 1960. The Willys coupe, specifically the 40 and 41 body styles, with their combination of short wheelbase, lightweight, and the aggressive nose-up stance that the car's suspension geometry accommodated, had become the dominant body style. Stone, Woods, Cook had not just won races, they had changed what the class looked like. The corporate response to what was happening in drag racing during the early to mid-1960s is one of the most instructive stories in American automotive history, because it illustrates the speed at which a grassroots competitive development can force a major corporation to respond with products it had not planned to offer. Chevrolet's position in the early 1960s was complicated by what would become known as the AMA ban, an informal agreement among American manufacturers to withdraw from direct factory racing support, motivated partly by safety concerns and partly by the desire to avoid the public relations costs of association with the increasingly lethal accidents that were afflicting motorsports. The ban was honored in public and violated extensively in private, with factory engineers finding ways to support racing programs through carefully constructed arm's-length arrangements, speed equipment distributors, and the practice of making racing-specific parts available through the parts catalog to anyone willing to order them. The problem, from Chevrolet's perspective, was that the catalog parts, the high-performance components that could be ordered by a dealer on behalf of a customer, were constrained by what the production engine architecture could accommodate. A customer who wanted a racing-ready Chevrolet for gasser competition was working with an engine family that had real limits in specific performance dimensions. The Chrysler Hemi, which had been designed from the beginning with performance potential in mind, could be developed further and faster in certain areas. This wasn't a secret. The time slips from national events and match races made it embarrassingly public. The Central Office Production Order System, COPO, was Chevrolet's internal mechanism for accommodating special orders that fell outside the normal production catalog. It had existed for years as a way to supply fleet buyers with unusual specifications. A police department wanting a particular engine in a particular body, a taxi company wanting a specific axle ratio. COPO was a tool for solving production problems, not a racing program. What happened in the mid-1960s and the Stonewood's Cook domination was a material contributor to the pressure that produced this outcome, was that Chevrolet began using the COPO system to make available to racers the engine combinations that the public catalog didn't list. The most famous eventual product of this process would be the COPO Camaros and Chevelles of the late 1960s, vehicles ordered through COPO with the largest displacement big block engines that Chevrolet's engineering department could package in those bodies. These were not street cars with racing options. They were functionally factory race cars delivered in streetcar clothing, exactly the conceptual architecture that Stonewood's Cook had pioneered in their shop in Akron years earlier. The causal chain requires nuance. No single racing team forces a corporation the size of General Motors to change its production procedures. But competitive pressure from multiple directions, and Stonewood's Cook was among the most consistent and public sources of that pressure. A team whose time slips appeared in Hot Rod magazine and National Dragster every time they showed up at a major event creates an environment where the corporate engineering and marketing departments have to respond or concede the field. Chevrolet's engineers knew that a purpose-built, Chrysler-powered Willys was beating their best catalog combinations in national competition. They knew it because the results were public. And they began, through the COPO mechanism and other channels, to build the equipment that would eventually close the gap. By the mid-1960s, the Stonewood's Cook team was confronting the specific problem that only the most dominant competitors ever face. How do you maintain relevance when your dominance has been so complete that the class has reorganized itself around defeating you? The Willys Gasser class had, in a real sense, been conquered. Not by other teams defeating Stonewood's Cook in a conventional sense. The team continued to win events and post impressive times, but by the universal adoption of the template they had established. When every serious team in A/Gas Supercharged is running a 40 or 41 Willys on a short wheelbase, stripped to minimum weight, with a Chrysler Hemi wearing a roots blower, the competitive advantage of having invented that formula dissolves. The innovation becomes the baseline. The field catches up not by being smarter, but by copying the smart answer that someone else worked out at considerable cost in time, money, and creativity. The team's response to this problem is instructive. Rather than treating the class's adoption of their template as a failure, Stonewood's Cook understood it as confirmation, the most definitive possible confirmation that they had been right. They had read the physics correctly. They had optimized the variables in the right order. The fact that everyone else now agreed with them, revealed by everyone else building the same car, meant the argument was over. What came next was finding the next argument. The next argument involved the NHRA's evolving rulebook, which, as governing bodies in all forms of motorsports perpetually do, was attempting to equalize a class that had become dominated by a single approach. Rules changes, weight penalties, and new classification requirements began to make the specific formula that Stonewood's Cook had refined less competitive at the margins. This is the moment in a racing program when teams face a genuinely difficult decision. Invest in adapting to the new rules with the same rigor and creativity that produced the original dominance, or accept that the era has ended and move toward a different chapter. Stonewood's Cook made both choices at different moments and in different ways, which is why the team's story doesn't have a clean ending. Racing programs rarely do. The car evolved, the rules evolved, the team evolved, and the specific combination of 41 Willys Coupe and Chrysler Hemi and Roots Blower and Lenny Stone's particular talent for making a short wheelbase car launch cleanly reached its moment of maximum effectiveness and then, as all such moments do, began to recede into history. Hot Rod Magazine, in a list of the 100 most influential hot rods in American automotive history, ranked the Stonewood's Cook 41 Willys at number 53. The ranking puts it ahead of vehicles with larger cultural profiles, ahead of cars that appeared in major motion pictures, ahead of machines that cost orders of magnitude more to build and operate. 53 means the editors and historians who compiled the list regarded it as more consequential than dozens of machines that enjoyed greater public visibility during their competitive careers. What the number captures, imperfectly but genuinely, is the magnitude of the influence. The car changed a class. The class change influenced how manufacturers thought about performance equipment. The manufacturer response, the COPO programs, the factory-backed drag racing operations, the willingness to build and sell purpose-designed racing engines through the part system, altered the American performance car market in ways that are visible in the cars that enthusiasts buy, restore, and worship to this day. The Camaro and Chevelle Copo cars of the late 1960s, objects of serious collector desire and stratospheric auction prices, exist in their specific form, partly because three men in Akron, Ohio, spent the late 1950s arguing that a 1941 Willys Coupe was the correct platform for maximum quarter-mile performance, and then proved it so convincingly that a major American corporation had to respond. The car itself, the actual Willys Coupe that Stone, Woods, and Cook built and raced, survives. It is in preservation, the subject of careful attention from people who understand what it represents. When it appears at major events and concours exhibitions, it tends to draw the kind of crowd that gathers not around spectacle, but around significance. People who know enough about the history to understand that they are looking at a machine that genuinely changed something. The burnout box at Lyons Associated Drag Strip in Long Beach doesn't exist anymore. The strip itself closed in 1972, one of the Southern California strips that fell to development pressure and noise ordinance complaints, and the general displacement of industrial-adjacent land, uses that accelerated through that decade. Pomona remains. Indianapolis Raceway Park, where the U.S. Nationals established the reputations of Stonewood's Cook and dozens of other teams, remains. But the specific atmosphere of the early 1960s gasser wars, the smell of rubber and hot metal and spent gasoline, the sound of a Roots blower straining at the top of second gear, the sight of a stubby Willys Coupe in its nose-high fighting stance lined up against someone who hadn't fully understood what they were agreeing to when they staged against it, that is gone, preserved only in photographs and in the memories of the people who were there. What Stonewood's Cook actually demonstrated, in the aggregate of their years of competition and their extraordinary winning record, and their influence on how an entire class of car was built and run, was that drag racing in its purest form rewards systematic thinking over instinctive approach. The car was not faster because of magic. It was faster because Lenny Stone sat down at some point in the late 1950s and worked through the variables: wheelbase, weight, displacement to weight ratio, combustion chamber geometry, supercharger sizing, and arrived at a set of answers that were simply correct. The correctness of the answers was demonstrated by putting the car on a drag strip, running it against the best competition available, and recording the elapsed times. The market for gasoline-era American performance cars, the auction houses, the restoration shops, the concours events, the collector community has largely caught up with what the racing record established 60 years ago. Willys coupes that would have been bought for near nothing in 1958 now command significant money at auction because the Stonewood's Cook record has filtered through the culture sufficiently that even people who have never watched drag racing understand that the Willys body style has a specific significance. The car that nobody wanted became the car that changed a sport. Lenny Stone was a quiet man by most accounts, which is the kind of detail that tends to get lost in the louder stories that surround dominant racers. He was not a showman on the order of Jungle Jim Lieberman, who understood that the match race circuit rewarded spectacle alongside performance. He was not a self-promoter in the style of the California speed shop owners, who cultivated relationships with the magazine editors and kept their names in print. He was a man who had figured something out, built a car that expressed what he had figured out, and then driven it until the results spoke for themselves. The results spoke at 149 miles per hour in 9.57 seconds, on gasoline out of a 1941 Willys Americar that had last seen a factory floor when the country was still 6 months from entering a world war. The results spoke at the U.S. Nationals and at Lions and at tracks from Ohio to California and back, in front of crowds that watched the nose of the Willys tip skyward at the launch and understood, in the visceral way that speed communicates, that they were watching something that wasn't supposed to be possible. The argument is settled. The numbers don't lie.